Yeah, and if you ever forget the reading assignments, I always do put them up on Friday on K-State Online. Like I said, I've added pages to this document that we're still working off of today, the Word document. And then next week we'll move into the first PowerPoint that I've also published, so you can print that out if you want to in the class. All right, so we left off on the topic of prophecy, and I think we get the point without belaboring it too much that Hobbes is skeptical about prophecy. As he says on page 123, the best prophet naturally is the best guesser, and the best guesser he that is most versed and studied in the matters he guesses at. That's on the top of 123. So in general, and I guess the only thing I want to add to this is that his motivation in saying this is not so much at this point to call into question biblical prophecy, although he does do that in other parts of the book. But I think that his main goal is to question the latter-day prophets, the prophets of his day, whom he would call would-be prophets, right? The preachers, the theologians, who were complaining and gaining support to rebel against the monarchy, right? So that with the idea that it was something worth fighting and dying for to have the right version of Christianity taught and required of people. Okay, so back in the day, when people felt like in order to be good Christians, they had to make sure that everybody else was saved too. Okay, does that make sense? I mean, it was an integral part of what it meant to be a Christian was to make sure that you didn't leave other people behind. And unfortunately, sometimes it was thought necessary to use force in order to do so. It doesn't make any sense, but in the sense that, as Locke points out, our next author, you can change people's behavior, but you can't change their, necessarily can't force what's inside. And even Hobbes, he even does know that, right? And he doesn't like the fact that so many people think it's okay to try to force people to believe in a certain way. That's counterproductive. So this is why, he makes that comment about prophecy. Now I want to talk about what he says in this chapter of speech, which is chapter 4, 124. Of course, he says, words are the symbols for the things that we see around us. So we create the words. And he goes into the Bible here a bit for his account. And Hobbes will do this. He'll use scripture to make a point. He uses it when he wants to, and he doesn't use it when he doesn't want to. But here it's convenient to talk about the Garden of Eden, and how Adam, and I went back and I looked to make sure it was actually, that this was the way it actually happened, okay? So, because sometimes Hobbes kind of messes with the Bible a little bit, but in this case, what it says is that God asked Adam to name the creatures. So it was Adam's decision how to name everything around him, okay?
Is this the chapter kind of when he talks about naming things and breaks it down?
Part of it, yeah, part
okay.
of it, right.
Okay.
In the, there's quite a bit of discussion about that in this chapter. So Adam created these names, and it's depicted as a pretty simple, straightforward process. The lion comes along. Oh, that's a lion. Oh, that's an elephant. Okay, fish, whatever, sky. All of these different words. But then he says, when human beings were punished at the Tower of Babel, everything changed. Okay, now what happened? Does anybody recall what happened?
where like they all speak different languages and they couldn't communicate.
Right. And why did that happen? Do you remember? Okay. Nobody remembers this one? Okay. What happened was the people built this tower, and the idea was that they were going to build it taller and higher than any other structure, and it was going to reach to the heavens. Okay. And so God looks at this and thinks that human beings have gone too far. They've usurped their particular status, right? And they're trying to become like God, trying to get too close. And so it's, sort of a story of human beings' aspirations and their, in a way, their arrogance, right? That they could be like God. And so as punishment for that, he destroys the tower, and he also makes it so that people cannot cooperate like they did before. And the way that he does that is to make people speak different languages. So suddenly there's all these languages, everybody, and that's why we have that word Babel, right? Is because now what other people are saying sounds like babble and nonsense. We don't understand them. And so they disperse, and this is sort of the explanation for the origins of different nations, right? All right, so keep that in mind, that it's human arrogance that caused it, because there's a lot of this, as you pointed out last time, there's this feeling of sort of original sin. He doesn't make a big deal of the actual original sin here, which is, the eating of the apple in the Garden of Eden, of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So instead, he puts the emphasis at this point in time on the Tower of Babel, when people got too close to God. And it is a better story as far as depicting what Hobbes dislikes about human beings, right? Because it's about people's ambition and their arrogance and their pride. And as you'll see as we go along, Hobbes thinks gets people into a lot of trouble, okay? So because of their pride, this happens. And then you have this diversity of language, and this makes it way harder for people to be able to not only cooperate, which is what God intended, but also it makes it harder for them to maintain peace. So it's the origins of war, right? Because now these are people here, they don't make any sense. We can't talk to them. We can't negotiate with them. It makes it much more challenging. So just take a look at the bottom left column of 125. He sort of sums up here. He says, to these uses there are 4 correspondent abuses of words. Okay, and this comes out of the language difficulties that now ensue, right? When before language was simple and straightforward, you had a word for things and for concepts too, but everybody understood. Okay, so he says now, first, when men register their thoughts wrong by the inconstancy of the signification of their words, by which they register for their conceptions that which they never conceived, and so deceive themselves. Okay, well, does anybody want to hazard a guess what that means? It's difficult wording, and he has a way of lengthy sentences. Okay, but when let's see, let's look at this again. When men register their thoughts wrong by the inconstancy of the signs of their words, right? So they don't use words in the same way. Even like one individual might use a word one way one time and another way another time.
I took it to be when they use it improperly,
Mm-hmm.
like words, like not just like differently, but like when one person thinks that his own words are
Yes.
inappropriate.
Right, inappropriately used. And it's very difficult to use them appropriately when you think about it, when, he's already told us that people perceive things differently. Yet he will come back to this idea that with enough effort, you could use speech accurately, or at least to the extent that you could all agree on what a word means.
It's
maybe.
interesting how he plays deception into it too, because he kind of says, and so deceive themselves. So he's saying by using the wrong words that you can deceive people, sort of, in a sense.
Yep. So lying, or at least maybe, as including obfuscation or confusing people with words, as well as lying, comes into play. So then he says, secondly, when they use words metaphorically, that is in another sense than that they are ordained for. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah, so there are certain words that, depending upon even the tone of your voice, can change their meaning and become metaphorical, or the opposite of what they might mean literally. So you deceive people in that way. Would you agree with that words can be used deceptively in that way too, right? Through metaphorical language or obscure language.
Bless your heart.
Yes, bless your heart. You've heard that a few times, have you? So have I. Yeah, it's a Southern expression, but it's made its way to Kansas. Thirdly, when by words they declare that to be their will, which is not. So that's a reference directly to lying, right? They'll say one thing but do another. Fourthly, when they use words to grieve one another. This is kind of cute, okay? For seeing nature hath armed living creatures, some with teeth, some with horns, and some with hands, to grieve an enemy, it is but an abuse of speech to grieve him with the tongue, unless it be one whom we are obliged to govern, and then it is not to grieve but to correct and amend. What's he talking about there, do you think? What was that?
That's sweet. He's saying don't insult people because it's offensive to the language itself.
Yeah, unless it's your son or daughter, apparently.
That's not a that's just correcting.
Right. So if you tell your son or daughter what to do or that they've made a mistake, that's your job. But if you do that with your fellow human beings, it's a form of abuse of sorts. You're grieving them. You're bothering them somehow. Yeah, and he uses this image again later on in this book that human beings hurt each other with their tongues. They become weapons. They become effective weapons that you can use to hurt people by stirring them up and causing them to be angry and causing them to hurt each other physically. So the tongue is a powerful thing. All right, so now we have words to lie, words to confuse, words that directly insult people or, boss them around, rile them up, get them excited and angry. All right, so this all comes after the Tower of Babel, supposedly. Now, that's the situation of language as he sees it. Okay, this is why communication is so hard. Because at this point, there's very little true communication occurring. Okay. Now, up on the top of page 126 on the right, we have a depiction of what he'd rather have language be, right? And he uses geometry here as his model. This is where you get that, people say Hobbes has a geometric method. He tries to emulate geometry. So he says, seeing then that the truth consists in the right ordering of names in our affirmations, in our declarations, a man that seeks precise truth had need to remember what every name he uses actually stands for. Okay? Kind of like Adam did it. And to place it accordingly, or else he will find himself entangled in words as a bird is in lime twigs, which they use to capture birds with. It's kind of like, fly tape, right? God forbid anybody should use that stuff. It's nasty. But, if you go to a store and you see flies stuck to this big strip, well, don't go back, right? They land and they can't get off. So it's a nice image here, the entrapped bird that's stuck. So the more he struggles, the more blind he becomes. And therefore in geometry, which is the only science it hath pleased God hitherto to bestow on mankind.
Yeah, I underline that, the fact that he would make a claim that big.
That's really, that's really big. That's certain, There were other sciences, and they thought that they had made a lot of progress.
And he just comes out and says, no, geometry's number one.
Yeah, not only number one, it's really the only
science.
Yeah, right. So that's like saying, oh, you guys at the universities who do your astronomy and your physics and biology, yeah, you don't really, that's not much of a science because you're not able to communicate well. You're not building knowledge in the way we do here.
Didn't it mention somewhere in the other reader that he actually included like physics and any kind of other mathematics into geometry?
Well, he did physics, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't know what all he would actually include in the scope of geometry and how he, I guess, how he got to that conclusion that they were all just the one.
He uses it in a way metaphorically. He uses it to describe a certain type of reasoning process. And physics does fit in there because physics is ruled by mathematics, right? You understand the physical, or you can understand the physical world through mathematics. But more than he's interested in that, he's just interested in the reasoning of geometry. And he wants to apply that way of reasoning to other areas. For him, the problem has been human beings haven't become precise at all when it comes to how they describe and account for their own behavior. And we need to create a political science that emulates the geometry and physics,
So he wanted to base political science off of the harder sciences?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so some people say he's the father of political science because he has this vision of studying human beings not through these obscure conceptualizations or philosophies, but very, very objectively, right? And the way that you have to start is with good, proper definitions that everybody can agree on. Now, I want to caution, because what we perceive is mediated, as we discussed, by our bodies. And our perspective is what we know of reality. We have to be extra careful about our definitions, and we also have to realize that to a certain extent, our agreement about definitions is arbitrary. But the most important thing is it come as close as we can possibly get to what we think reality is, and even more important is that we all agree on those definitions. Because if we can't all agree, then we can't build any other knowledge. As soon as if we disagree about the basic terms, we start splintering off into our schools of thought, and we can't build knowledge.
So you said that's kind of the first step, is to agree on basic definitions and then go from there.
Exactly. And that's why he spends so much time on, the wrong use of language, and then he starts to try to build definitions in these chapters of important words that describe the human experience.
Well, so I know he was an abject opponent of Aristotle, but it sounds like he likes the logical part of geometry, which
Yes.
Aristotelian logic is still a thing today.
Mm-hmm.
He just wasn't gonna throw Aristotle that bone.
No. People had made too many mistakes with Aristotle in his view. And I suppose if we were to cut Aristotle a little bit of a break, he might have thought that the abuse of Aristotelian reasoning was really the problem. I mean, most of his focus really, when he complains about Aristotle, certainly what he has in mind is the university academics and the theologians that use Aristotle. But I have to say, nowhere does he say, Aristotle had a basically good method, but it's been abused. So we would be reading into that a little bit. So, no. And I get your point that there's maybe not as much distance between Hobbes's call for logic and Aristotle as he would like to think. Yeah, that maybe he's being a little unfair. Because he doesn't jump to, for instance, you know what Dr. Sorensen talks about in DAS 300, a real advance would be experimental science, you know, and Hobbes doesn't do that. There's no experimental mentality in his works. He doesn't go out and actually confirm directly anything he says about human behavior. There's no statistics, there's no, you know, psychological experiments either. He assumes that he knows certain things based on his personal experiences and perceptions. So, yeah, so that's not as far from Aristotle as maybe he would like. Yeah, I see some Greek on the next page.
You know what that word is?
That's logos. It's
Really?
127 on the left-hand side, first paragraph, logos, which means speech and reason. In that case, he's kind of defined it for you. It's also translated as the word in the Bible when in Genesis it says God created or something like God was the word, something like that. It's logos in Greek anyway. I don't know what
Greek pretty well?
Not pretty well, but
Yeah.
enough to be able to translate. I used to know it better because I worked with Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and I had to do side by side.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah,
Oh, God.
but I can still figure out the basics anyway. It's hard, and there's a difference between biblical Greek, which is later, than Thucydides' Greek, which is archaic.
Yeah, and Greek's a pretty tough language, isn't it?
Cities in English is pretty tough.
It's crazy. There's so many different declensions, they call them, different ways that the word changes according to not only the tense, but the object. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I never did totally get that, but I did my very best. And I had to teach myself because they didn't have a Greek program at the university that I was at. And in order to be credible, I had to know enough Greek to be able to translate certain crucial passages anyway. So my dissertation advisor just said, here's these books, read them. I was like, okay, help me. All right, so anyway, all right, well, to complete what he says there, so he says, therefore in geometry, the only science, men begin at settling the significations of their words, which settling of significations they call definitions, and place them in the beginning of their reckoning. Okay? So that is the ideal, right? To place those definitions which they have settled on, which means they have agreed upon, right? At the beginning of all their thought, their reckoning is thinking, okay? Sounds simple, yet it's not simple. And as we know, even today in political science, depending upon which particular school of thought, you know, in international relations or comparative or American government, and there's schools of thought within those subfields, people can easily be talking past each other using terms that mean different things to different people. So he's right there that, unless you're very, very careful, don't make assumptions about what a word means, you can easily be misunderstood. And how can you have a political science if you can't get past this language difficulty, right? So we still don't pay as much attention to that as we should. Now he contrasts this ideal of, very precise speech and agreement on terms with what the academics of his day actually do. And he says they come up with all sorts of just, what do we call it, jargon. I think that would be a word he would use if it existed at his time. It didn't, but they come up with jargon, some of which they just simply make up, or they combine words together that don't make any sense together, okay? And then by doing this, they make themselves sound intelligent, right? Which is another thing that people still do. I mean,
It's like scientism.
yes, right. Scientism. It's not science. It's sort of pseudoscience. It's the appearance of science, right? And you know, in philosophy, in political philosophy, sometimes this is the case too. The one that springs to mind is Eric Voegelin, and you know, Voegelin has some interesting things to say. But if you've ever check it out sometime, his last name is spelled Voeglin. Voegelin creates many terms and redefines others. So he uses the phrase immanentizing the transcendent, for instance. Immanentizing the transcendent, which if you think about it enough, you can understand. But it takes you quite a bit more time. As you read it, you almost have to translate it. You do. You have to translate it for yourself. Hegel was like that. He said some very brilliant things, but he made up his own terminology. And so there's still so much disagreement about what Hegel even meant by certain words. Same thing with Voegelin. So I think Hobbes is one of those people, and I think we can sympathize with this, who says, you know, if you cannot say it in a way that is understandable to intelligent people without them having to translate, then you have not communicated well enough. And how can they use your knowledge and build upon it, right? Now, with the theologians, things were even worse because some of the words that they created not only didn't make logical sense, but they didn't really they didn't really apply to anything in the real world. So they didn't actually symbolize something that existed in his view. So he says, for instance, this term down at the bottom of 127 on the right, incorporeal body. Okay, incorporeal means non-bodily. Okay, non-bodily body. Okay, or a non-existent body. But Hobbes would say, but body implies physical presence, right? But incorporeal means not physical. How can you have a not physical thing? Doesn't make any sense. It's not there. And furthermore, when they use this term, it's to describe something like an angel, a spirit of some kind. And, you know, where is that? Where is it? So he's very dubious about this, and he thinks that it's there. These are terms that are used, as we said a while back, to kind of confuse or to throw people off a little bit, right? So that they think, oh, he's talking about something very important, but without really thinking about what does it really mean, okay? He likens it to the phrase round quadrangle. He says that signifies nothing if you use the term round quadrangle, because a quadrangle, of course, has 4 corners. By definition, it can't be round. And he talks about another term that is used by these theologians is in-poured or in-blown virtue. Okay, inspiration is another term that means the same thing, basically, that was used. What does that really mean? Well, it's as though you got the virtue, whatever that is, from something outside of yourself that is being put into you. Okay, where does that come from? What does that really mean? Inspiration is the same thing. Inspiring literally means to breathe into. Okay, that's where the word comes from in Latin, to breathe into. And I mean, the idea there is that in the case of inspiration, God breathes into the person, the spirit, right? And gives them this new idea that they didn't have before. So now he's getting into kind of controversial territory here, because what would the theologians say to his picking apart of their terms, specifically these?
Yeah.
What was that?
Heresy.
Yeah, they would say, my gosh, you're questioning a very fundamental concept that God can inspire people, that God can speak to people through the spiritual side, right? So, and some people did react to this in this way.
I can see why people thought he was an atheist at the time.
Yeah. I find it hard. Now, I will tell you, there are people who argue that he was not, and they put up a pretty valiant effort to do so.
Didn't he have some really weird religious change and shift in beliefs toward the end of his life? Suddenly, or it might be just something else?
No, I think maybe he might have confessed at the end of his life, but I'm not sure I would say that was proof of a major religious conversion. Hobbes might have been hedging his bets. Maybe he was intellectually honest at that point and didn't know, but he didn't have a major religious change or conversion. Yeah, he must be. Maybe Machiavelli. Machiavelli had, I don't think he had a huge conversion either, but he definitely did call for last rites. But no, Hobbes didn't change his point of view.
Seems
but
like a lot of realists stick by what they've wrote about or known their whole life. They're very stubborn to change.
Yes. But exactly what he believed is an open question. Our last candidate is somebody who is sort of on the other side of this debate. The majority opinion in scholarship is that Hobbes, if not an atheist, was a very bare bones deist at the most, and that his views didn't correspond to any religious sect of the day very well at all. But there are a few people who are making a really valiant case, trying to muster as much evidence as they possibly can, that Hobbes did believe in God, and that his natural law teaching, which they believe is a true natural law teaching, flows from that. And you will see, he does speak of natural law, but then he says it's not binding, it doesn't apply either in nature or after the social contract. So it's a tough case to make, but I wouldn't want to lead you astray that, it's a 100% closed case. There are people who and part of the problem for them is, well, why does Hobbes spend so much time on religion if it doesn't mean something to him? Because he has a whole third part of his book that deals with the Christian commonwealth. And the answer to that question from the majority perspective is he does this because he knows that Christianity is the number one most influential religion.
Well, yeah, that's what I was getting ready to say. It was so big at the time because, he cites it as one of his main issues, so he might feel the need to address it. So I can see where they get that from.
So in that case, he would have to be trying to reconcile his very materialistic views with Christianity somehow, and showing that they can go together. But on the other side of that debate, they say, no, he's really grappling with, the spiritual dimension here of Christianity. What can we really believe, and that it can guide us if we understand it correctly, and that a lot of people haven't understood it correctly. So there's room for interpretation there. All right, so, but yes, at the very least, he's whacking away. We can't argue about that. He's whacking very hard at all the theologians and the scholars who have, in his view, confused people, and this confusion has led to arguments and disagreements, and that leads to war. So he really implicates the intellectuals for the conflict. It's these people who are really, they ought to be lending their talents to peace, and making people understand why it's important to cooperate and obey, and instead they stir up all sorts of trouble with all of their babble. Okay, so he makes it clear that the passions of people are what generally lead them in their use of words. So first they have these passions, and then they use, as we've discussed before, their reason and speech to follow their passions. And down at the bottom of page 128 on the left, he says, therefore, in reasoning, a man must take heed of words which, besides the signification of what we imagine of their nature, have a signification also of the nature, disposition, and interests of the speaker. Okay, so words don't just mean what some external object is, but they reflect the nature, the mood, and the interests of the speaker. Such are the names of virtues and vices. So when you move from talking about objects to talking about these concepts that have to do with morality, then you really get into a matter of perspective where the nature and the mood and the interests of the speaker come into play. And this is really crucial for understanding Hobbes's thought on these terms. He says, for one man calleth wisdom what another man calleth fear. One cruelty what another justice. Okay? So in the first case, okay, this person says, you know what, I think we better get out of here because there's a crime about to be committed over there and I don't want to have any part of it. I don't want to be involved. Okay? One person with him looks at him and goes, what a coward. Don't you think that you ought to go over there with us and try to stop this crime from happening? Another person with him says, you know, that's right. That's prudent and smart. We can't probably stop this anyway, and at least we'll be safe. We can go call the police, right? So two different people, one sees wisdom, the other sees fear, okay, or cowardice. In the case of cruelty and justice, the death penalty is seen by some people as terribly inhumane, and by other people as ultimately necessary justice for certain crimes. Okay? So we have huge debates about that. One, prodigality, which means wastefulness. One person sees wastefulness, another sees magnanimity, which is a sort of generosity. Okay? So when you throw that big feast for your pals at the country club, are you being wasteful and sort of, I don't know, just out for people's admiration, or are you being generous? It depends on who you talk to. Some people are going to be jealous of how much money you have, right? And they're going to say, God, what a waste of money. You should be, giving it to charity, or he should be expanding his business and hiring more people, but instead he's spending $500,000 on this so that everybody can see. Other people who go to the party and who get to have the nice, filet mignon and champagne say, this is really nice. What a generous guy, what a great guy, and he invited my whole family, and now I know him better, and this is great, right? So you get the point? So it depends upon the perspective of the person hearing the word too, and what that speaker has done for them, how they feel about the speaker, right? Very much a matter of perspective. So he says, therefore, such names can never be the true grounds of any ratiocination, which means reasoning. No more can metaphors and tropes of speech, but these are less dangerous because they profess their inconstancy, which the others do not. So the words that he's talked about, they have to do with very fundamental human evaluations. They're evaluative, right? And those are the most dangerous words of all, the ones that we use to evaluate each other, especially our moral qualities, right? And they're the ones that are most interpretable depending upon the speaker and the listener. you know. I mean, literally, if you like a person, everything they say is more likely to be acceptable to you. And another person, if you dislike them, everything they say is suspect, right? And you take it in the worst way possible, right? So these words are very dangerous words. He's going to have to do something with them if he's going to get into political science, because this is the human science, right? And so much of politics is about morality and justice. In particular, justice is what he's concerned about, because the law is what people, experience as justice. So you've got to have agreement ultimately about what justice is in order to have laws that people will obey. So, but he's basically saying here, this is a very, very difficult thing. This is the toughest, most difficult thing that he's going to try to do, to deal with terms in a way where we can cut through even that level of subjectivity and get to some sort of certainty and knowledge about it. What would the postmodern person say about that? The postmodern philosopher would say that's totally impossible. You cannot get past perspective. So in this way, he's a little closer to Aristotle than to the postmodern philosopher or the existentialist, because at least he thinks, yes, with enough incredible effort, we could reason about these things, right? And the true postmodernist, everything is relative.
But couldn't they say, well, yeah, that's great, you can all do that for your time and your location.
Yes.
But as soon as I move south a bit, and maybe like 2 decades later, that's no longer the case.
Well, you're right about that, right? They would be able to say you could reason within your little sphere, right? And for your particular time, and to a certain extent come up with something that would work, although it's still, even with individuals, if you press these people, they will say individual perspective, is important too. But of course, Hobbes would never be happy with this, because for him, he's going to try to make a political science that applies to all people at all times, right? He thinks there's these universal, eternal human traits, and that logic is sort of universal too. It's not particular to Englishmen or a different logic from Italian logic or whatever. So he wouldn't like it, and they wouldn't like him particularly. But he still has this faith that you can use reason to solve problems. Okay, so we have enough time to deal with chapter 6, I think, which is of the interior beginnings of voluntary motion. To a certain extent, I touched on some of this before, so we can maybe move through it pretty quickly. But he does depict thinking as a sort of physical process. He says, even though we cannot see the movements within the mind, there must be these tiny movements that exist, and the process of thinking is a going back and forth between what he calls appetites and aversions. We are attracted or repelled to certain things, okay? And so let's see. He says on the right-hand side of 132, whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it, which he for his part calleth good. Okay, this is the important part here, okay? That which you have a desire for is what you call good. And the object of his aversion, which may be nothing more than, the sensation hits his particular body and disposition, and it repels it. He instinctually doesn't like this, in other words. It's not rational, right? But it becomes evil in his mind, okay? Certain people, just because I think Hobbes would say our ears are built differently. So when you hear classical music, you like it, right? And when I hear classical music, I hate it, it's especially orchestral music. I hate orchestra music. And so it's just irritating. It's the same music, okay? But it must be that our ears are built slightly differently, and it has a different impact upon our brain, and therefore it repels me, and I call it bad. I wouldn't say evil, but bad, you know. Well, that's one thing, but he's talking about human moral qualities too. So this particular human being's decision or action, I don't like it. It just strikes me the wrong way. It's evil, okay? So he says, for these words of good, evil, and contemptible, they are used with relation to the person that useth them. They're relative to the individual who uses them. There being nothing simply and absolutely so. Okay, there's nothing simply and absolutely so or true, nor any common rule of good and evil to be taken from the nature of the objects themselves, but from the person of the man, from the person that representeth it. Okay? That's quite a statement there. And that's where he would depart from a Plato or Aristotle, right? They would say, you know, there's these eternal ideas, actually, well, at least Plato would, of justice and injustice, good and evil, right? And certainly in the world, if you reason correctly, certain human traits and behaviors are good and some are evil, okay? And he's saying here, there's no external good or evil. Something is not good or evil in and of itself. We make it good or evil by how we perceive it. We are the source of good and evil, okay? And that makes it very difficult, again, for us to agree on these very crucial terms, okay? So keep that in mind. That's just something that we'll be coming back to, okay? There's an example on 134 I wanted to point out. Middle of the left-hand column, he says, fear of power invisible, feigned or falsified or faked by the mind or imagined from tales publicly allowed is called religion, not allowed superstition. Okay? So that's just a crucial application of what he said before. It's crucial to our understanding of what he thinks is the problem with religion. One person calls it the true religion. Another person says, no, that's superstition. This is the true religion. Okay? Mine is the true religion. Now, the English people tended to apply that to Catholicism. They looked at what Catholics believe and they said that's superstition. So it's kind of interesting that he would say that here, because in a way, if you apply this logically to that case, you would have to say, well, there's nothing to that. You know, Catholics think their religion is true. Other people think it's superstition. Catholic thinks that Protestants are superstitious, and so they're relative, basically, in that case. But he won't come right out and say those things, right? He just drops these teachings in here that just would blow people's minds and make them think, whoa, what's he really saying here? Now, the truly prejudiced Englishman would say, well, Hobbes is obviously speaking of Catholicism here, and he wouldn't necessarily get the overall teaching of relativism that is obviously there. You know, people misread these things, right? Mm-hmm. Who knows? Maybe Hobbes is strategically. He does tend to just drop things, and then he'll back off, right, and not say anything for a while, and then drop another one. And, you know, if you weren't careful about your reading, you could miss the implications. Yeah. There's one in his chapter on religion that we'll have to look at. But we're out of time. So we'll pick back up and finish this all off on Monday.